Hello and welcome back. Now we're ready to implement damage with the enemy, which means we need to set up some things on the enemy class. We're going to start by adding some collision volumes to the enemy's weapons. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing we need to do is add sockets to our skeleton on Grux. So let's go into the Paragon Grux folder and go to Characters, Heroes, Grux, Meshes, and open Grux Skeleton. Now here on the Grux Skeleton, we need to add sockets so we can attach some collision volumes to the skeleton. Now I'm going to take a look at the hand, and here we have hand R and hand L. And if we scroll down to the skeleton where there's the hand R, we'll see that there are some weapon bones. There's a weapon R attached to hand R. So the weapon R bone is really what the weapon mesh is skinned to. If we take that weapon bone and we move it, you'll see that we can actually detach it from the enemy. So this is useful to know if you wanted to, say, have a melee game and you want to use this weapon without the character mesh or detach the weapon from the mesh. Maybe when the enemy dies, you detach the weapon. This weapon is skinned to the weapon R bone. And of course, the weapon L is skinned to the weapon L bone. So we have the weapon R and weapon L bones, and we're going to add some sockets to these. So for the weapon R, I'm going to right-click and add socket. I'm going to right-click on the socket and rename it to right weapon bone. And I'm also going to find weapon L, so I'm going to just search for weapon here. And take weapon L, select that, and I'm going to right-click and add a socket to this, and right-click and rename this socket left weapon bone. So now we have the right weapon bone and the left weapon bone. And we're going to use these bones to attach some collision volumes that we create. So go ahead and click Save and close the Grux skeleton. And we're now ready to jump into C++ to create these collision volumes. Okay, so I'm here in the enemy.h header file, and I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the private variables section so we can create a couple new private variables. We're going to need some box components. So I'm going to forward declare uBoxComponent, and this will be a box component pointer. And I'm going to call this first one left weapon collision. Now I'm going to give this a uProperty macro, and I'd like to make this visible anywhere, blueprint read write, category combat, meta allow private access. Now for the comment on this one, we're going to say collision volume for the left weapon. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole thing and paste it. And on this second one, we don't need this class keyword. We've already forward declared the uBoxComponent class. And this will be the collision volume for the right weapon. And I'm going to call this one right weapon collision. Now we have the pointers. We now need to construct these in the constructor for enemy. So let's go into the enemy constructor, and right off the bat I'm going to include the header for box component. So here's uBoxComponent in the documentation. Here's the header file. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. Now here in the constructor, we're going to construct the left and right box collisions. So we have left weapon collision, and we're going to use create default subobject for this. And we're going to use uBoxComponent, and for the text, we'll just say left weapon box. Now we need to set up attachment for this, and we're going to attach this to our newly created left weapon bone. So we need to take our left weapon collision and call setup attachment. And setup attachment takes the scene component. We're going to use the mesh, followed by an optional weapon bone name. This is an F name, and we're going to pass in left weapon bone. Now we need to create the right weapon collision. So we're going to say right weapon collision equals create default subobject using uBox component. And for the text on this one, I'm just going to say right weapon box. Now we're going to take right weapon collision and call setup attachment using getMesh and an fname. And for this one, we're going to use our right weapon bone. And I'll go ahead and put a comment here and say construct left and right weapon collision boxes. Now we've created these collision boxes, and we're going to want some overlap events to be triggered with these collision boxes, which means we need callback functions for when the box overlaps. So we're going to create overlap begin functions for both of these. So let's go up to enemy.h in the protected section and create a couple of functions. The first one we'll call on left weapon overlap. And for the input parameters, I'm simply going to go back to our item.cpp file and find onSphere overlap and copy the input parameters for this function. Now I can go back into enemy.h and paste those in here. Now this needs to be a U function, of course. And I can simply copy this function and paste it and create another one and call this one on right weapon overlap. And now we have overlap functions for the left and right collision boxes. Let's create some function bodies for these. So now here we have some callback functions. Now we need to bind these functions to overlap events for the left and right weapon boxes, and we're going to do this in begin play. So let's go to begin play, and we're already doing this for the aggro sphere and the combat range sphere. We need to do this for the weapon collision boxes. So I'm going to copy the aggro sphere binding and paste it down here. And instead of aggro sphere, I'm going to use left weapon collision. So we have left weapon collision on component begin overlap, add dynamic, and for the function, we need to use our newly created function on left weapon overlap. So I'm going to put that for the callback function. Now that's for the left weapon. Let's bind a function for the right weapon. So this one is going to have right weapon collision, and it's going to bind on right weapon overlap. Excellent. So now we have functions bound to overlap events for the left and right weapon boxes. Now I'd like to set the collision settings for these boxes right here in begin play. So let's go ahead and add a comment to what we just did and say bind functions to overlap events for weapon boxes. And just below this, we're going to create another comment and say set collision presets for weapon boxes. Now I'm going to take the left weapon collision and I'm going to call set collision enabled, and I'm going to set this to e collision enabled no collision. Now if that seems confusing, just think of it this way. We don't want our weapon collision colliding with anything until we're ready. That is, until the enemy is actually swinging the weapon. When the enemy's just walking around, we don't really need it to be colliding and triggering overlap events. So we want to enable collision exactly at the right time. Now we also want to set the collision object type. So we're going to say left weapon collision set collision object type, and we're going to use e collision channel world dynamic. Now next we're going to set the collision response to all channels. We only want our collision box to overlap with the pawn collision object type. That's because we only want it to collide with our character. So let's go ahead and set left weapon collision by calling set collision response to all channels. And this takes an e collision response, and we're going to select ignore. And since we only want overlap events when this box overlaps with the pawn collision type, we're going to set the collision response to the pawn to overlap. So we're going to say left weapon collision, set collision response to channel, E collision channel pawn, and E collision response overlap. And I'll go ahead and set these two parameters on their own lines so you can see what's going on here. Now, this is going to take care of the left weapon collision. We need to take care of the right weapon collision. So I'm going to paste all of this, except instead we're going to use right weapon collision. So I'm going to change each of these to use right weapon collision, and all the rest of the code can remain the same. So this takes care of setting the collision presets for our weapon boxes. All right, let's go ahead and compile this code and head back into the editor. All right, so we're back in the editor. We're going to go ahead and open up our enemies folder, open enemy BP, and in enemy BP, we now have attached to our mesh the left weapon collision box and the right weapon collision box. And if we zoom in, we'll see that they're attached to the hands. Actually, more specifically, they're attached to the weapon bones. Now, relative to the weapon bones, we can move these, and we want to move them so that they encompass the weapon itself. Now, it's going to be a little hard when Grux is in this idle animation. He's kind of moving around a bit. So we want to freeze this mesh. So let's go ahead and select the mesh. And in the details panel, there is a checkbox next to pause anims. If you check that, then the animations will pause. That's what we need in order to work on this. Now, I'm going to select left weapon collision. And I'm going to move this box up just a bit and scale it so that it fits around the weapon. So let's scale this just a bit like this. And I'm just going to kind of toggle between scaling and moving. And something roughly like this should work. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to encompass the overall shape of the weapon. I'm going to do the same for right weapon collision. So let's move it up, scale it just a bit in both the Z and X dimensions, local dimensions, and I'll go ahead and make it a bit longer. Like so. In fact, I might make it a little thinner, like so. Okay, so those look relatively even. I think that looks pretty good. So we now have these collision boxes, and we've set the collision presets. And so far, they're set to not have any collision. We're going to take care of collision in a future video. For now, this is a good stopping point. I think we have this set up for overlapping, and we're ready to start causing some damage. So great job. We're going to continue this in the next video. I'll see you then.